Elena stood by the kitchen counter, staring blankly at the clock on the wall. It was late, too late, and Michael still wasn't home. The quiet of the house felt suffocating. The kids had gone to bed hours ago, and the silence was now a constant companion, one she couldn't shake. She didn't mind it usually, but tonight it was different. She couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, that the world she had carefully built was starting to crumble beneath her. For the past few months, things with Michael had been distant. It wasn't one thing, just a series of small, unnoticed changes. The way he came home late, his face buried in his phone instead of talking to her. The quiet dinners, the lack of laughter, the lack of everything. When was the last time they really talked? Really looked at each other the way they used to, the way they did when they were young? Elena couldn't remember. The kiss they'd shared that morning seemed to echo in her mind now. It had been so brief, so quick, but it had felt real. Michael had kissed her goodbye with the same empty passion he always had. She had felt nothing but the coldness of it, the routine. And then there was Chris. Chris had been Michael's best friend for years, the guy who always showed up at family gatherings, the one who made jokes and lightened the mood. At first, she hadn't thought anything of it. He was a friend, a part of their life. But over the past few months, Elena started noticing how differently he looked at her. He wasn't like Michael, distant and preoccupied. He saw her. He made her feel like she mattered, like she was more than just a wife, a mother. He made her feel alive again. Tonight, it had started innocently enough. Michael had been working late again, and Chris had called, saying he was in town and wanted to stop by. Elena had tried to brush it off, but when he showed up, the tension between them was palpable. Chris was different tonight. There was something in the way he looked at her, the way he smiled, too knowing, too intense. She tried to ignore it, focusing on dinner and the kids, but the air between them felt electric. Every word, every glance seemed to hold more weight than it should. She hadn't meant for it to happen, but when Chris touched her arm, something inside her sparked. It was nothing, a brush of his fingers, a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make her heart race. She couldn't breathe. Was this really happening? Was she really considering this? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Chris had come closer, his presence filling the space between them. He smiled again, a half smirk, as if he knew what was happening but wasn't sure what to do about it. "Are you okay?" Chris asked softly, his voice low, like he was already aware of the storm brewing inside her. Elena swallowed hard, the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know how to answer him. Could she even be honest with herself about what was happening? What did it mean? And more importantly, what was she willing to risk? Her marriage, her family, the life she had built? Was it worth it? "I'm fine," Elena lied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Chris didn't seem convinced, his eyes searching hers, probing for something she wasn't sure she could give. And then it happened. Without thinking, without warning, he leaned in. His lips brushed hers, soft but insistent, like he was claiming a part of her that had long been missing. For a moment, Elena stood frozen, her body betraying her. She didn't pull away. She didn't stop him. She couldn't. It wasn't just about the kiss. It was about the way he made her feel, about the way his touch was electric, like it was sparking something she hadn't felt in years. But as quickly as it happened, it ended. Chris pulled back, and Elena was left standing there, breathless, with 1,000 conflicting emotions swirling inside her. "What have I done?" she thought, her heart racing in her chest. She felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones, the enormity of what had just occurred hitting her all at once. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But what now? Could she face Michael? Could she face herself? The guilt began to creep in slowly, gnawing at her, but underneath it, there was something else, a strange sense of longing, of desire. The truth was, she had been living in a shadow for far too long, and now with Chris, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what she was going to do. But as the sound of the door closing behind Chris echoed in the house, Elena knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The hours that followed felt like an eternity. Elena tried to push the kiss out of her mind, but it lingered there, haunting her. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the pressure of Chris's lips against hers, the heat of his touch. It wasn't just the kiss, it was the way he made her feel, the way he had made her feel alive in a way Michael hadn't in months. No, that wasn't fair, Elena told herself. Michael wasn't the problem. I am. She stood in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of dinner, but her hands felt numb. She didn't know how she was going to look at Michael when he came home. How could she face him knowing what she'd just done? How could she pretend that everything was okay? How could I do this to him? The thought echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of her betrayal. And yet, in the midst of the guilt, a part of her couldn't ignore the burning desire for more. Every time she thought of Chris, a surge of excitement ran through her veins. Why is it so easy with him? Why did it feel like he understood her in ways Michael hadn't in a long time? The sound of the door creaking open pulled her from her thoughts. Michael was home. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Elena took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She plastered on a smile, the same smile she had been wearing for weeks. Fake, forced, covering the truth she wasn't ready to face. "Hey," Michael said as he walked into the kitchen, his voice tired but warm. He leaned over and kissed her cheek, but it felt hollow. There was no real connection, no spark, just a routine. "Hey," Elena replied, her voice tight. She tried to focus on the dishes in front of her, afraid he'd see through the facade she was putting up. "How was your day?" Michael shrugged, setting his briefcase down on the counter. "Same old, busy." He paused for a moment, then added, "I missed you tonight. It's been a long week." Days passed in a blur. Elena felt like she was living in two separate worlds. In one, there was the life she had built with Michael and their children. Safe, comfortable, routine. But in the other, there was Chris. The excitement, the desire, the dangerous connection they shared. The two lives never truly intersected. One was a facade, the other a hidden, chaotic truth. But Elena couldn't pretend forever. The weight of her secret was becoming too much to bear. Every time she looked at Michael, every time she kissed him good morning or made small talk over dinner, she felt the heavy burden of the lie she was living. The guilt was suffocating. She could no longer deny that something inside her had changed. It wasn't just the kiss with Chris anymore. It was the longing she felt every time he smiled at her, every time their eyes met, as if there was something more between them. It was wrong, so wrong, but it felt so real. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt seen. She felt wanted, desired in a way she hadn't in years. But the cost of that desire was becoming clearer by the day. That afternoon, Chris had texted her. Just a simple message. "I need to see you. Let's talk." Elena's heart had skipped a beat when she read it. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about him since that night. But now the thought of seeing him again filled her with both excitement and dread. How much longer could she keep this secret? How much longer could she hide from the truth that was becoming more real with each passing day? It wasn't long before Chris showed up at the house. Michael was still at work, and the kids were at a friend's house for the afternoon. Elena felt her pulse quicken when she saw him standing in the doorway. His presence filled the space with something electric, something dangerous. They didn't speak immediately. Chris just stood there looking at her, as if waiting for her to make the first move. His eyes were intense, searching, but there was something else there too. Something that made Elena's chest tighten with fear. The connection between them was undeniable, but so was the reality of what she had already done. "Elena," Chris said softly, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to talk about what happened. I can't keep pretending that this is nothing. What we shared, it's not just a mistake." Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew he was right. What had started as a fleeting moment of weakness had turned into something she couldn't ignore. The chemistry between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional too, and now it was tearing her apart. "I know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I know, but I don't know what to do. Michael doesn't deserve this. The kids, what will they think of me if they find out?" Chris took a step closer, his gaze softening. but there was an intensity behind his words that made Alina's heart race. You have to decide what you want, Elena. This can't keep going on like this. It's eating you up inside. Elena closed her eyes, her hands shaking. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted. She didn't know if she could go back to the way things were with Michael, or if she even wanted to. The pull toward Chris was so strong, so overwhelming, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the destruction it would bring. She would lose everything: her family, her life, her marriage. I can't keep doing this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't keep lying. I can't keep hiding from Michael, from myself. Chris reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice low and comforting. But you have to make a choice. The weight of his words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She had been living in this limbo for too long. She had been pretending, lying to everyone, including herself. But now the truth was right in front of her, and she couldn't avoid it any longer. As Chris's hand lingered on her shoulder, Elena felt the conflict inside her intensify. Her heart was torn in two. One part of her desperately wanted to give in to the passion she felt for Chris, wanted to be with him, to escape the life she had been living. But the other part of her, the part that still loved Michael, the part that wanted to keep her family intact, was telling her to stop, to walk away before it was too late. But it was already too late, wasn't it? The days following her meeting with Chris were torturous. Elena tried to go back to her normal routine, but it felt impossible. The walls of her life, the life she had built with Michael, the life she thought was solid, were starting to crack. Every time she looked at him, her stomach turned. Every touch, every word, felt like a reminder of the betrayal she had committed. She couldn't escape it. Elena knew Michael could sense the shift in her. The distance between them wasn't just emotional anymore. It was physical. She avoided his gaze at dinner, his hand on her back when they walked together. The intimacy that had once been so natural between them. Now it felt awkward, forced. She was a stranger in her own home. Is everything okay? Michael asked one evening, his voice tinged with concern as they sat down to eat. He had been quiet lately, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a quiet wariness. Elena forced a smile, but it felt brittle, like it might shatter with the slightest touch. Yeah, I'm just tired, she lied, not wanting to burden him with the truth. But Michael didn't seem convinced. He studied her, his brow furrowed, before speaking again. You've been acting off for days now, Elena. What's going on? She froze. The words that had been building inside her for weeks, months, seemed to hang in the air, choking her. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to confess, to come clean about the kiss with Chris, about the growing distance between them. But how could she? How could she possibly look at Michael, the man she had promised to love, and admit that she had fallen into someone else's arms? I don't know, Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I guess I've just been overwhelmed with everything. Work, the kids, life. It just feels like too much sometimes. Michael nodded slowly, but Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe her. She couldn't fool him anymore, and she knew it. The silence between them grew thicker, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavily in the air. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Michael turned to her as they lay in bed together. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch soft but searching. I don't want to lose you, Elena, he said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. But I can't help but feel like something's wrong. You've been pulling away from me for weeks. Elena's heart ached. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the vulnerability that he had never shown her before. He had always been the strong one, the one who carried their family with quiet strength. But now he was breaking, and she was the one who had shattered him. I'm sorry, Elena whispered, though the words felt hollow. I don't know what's happening to me. Michael didn't say anything. He just pulled her closer, as if trying to hold on to whatever was left of their connection. Elena's body responded to him. She wanted to lean into him, to find comfort in his embrace. But her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't just Chris anymore. It was the guilt, the overwhelming weight of what she had done, what she was still doing. The next day, the guilt took its toll on Elena in a way she hadn't anticipated. As she sat in the living room, waiting for the kids to come home from school, she received a message from Chris. The simple notification on her phone sent a wave of panic through her. "I need to see you. I can't stop thinking about you. This has to stop, Elena. You have to make a choice." The words hit her like a punch. She knew what the choice was, didn't she? She had been living in a lie, torn between her family and the desire she felt for Chris. But now Chris was demanding an answer. And Elena knew deep down that her marriage, her life with Michael, was hanging by a thread. Could she choose Chris? Could she choose the excitement, the passion? Or was her family worth saving? Her heart raced as she debated responding. She couldn't risk losing everything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was already lost. Elena knew she had to talk to Michael, but the thought of facing him, of telling him the truth, terrified her. Could she live with the consequences of her actions? Could she live with the shame of what she had done? Later that evening, Michael returned home from work, looking more exhausted than usual. Elena could see the dark circles under his eyes, the weight of whatever was wrong between them hanging heavy on him. They barely exchanged words during dinner, the silence stretching between them. Elena felt like she was suffocating. As Michael cleaned up the dishes, Elena stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her hands trembling at her sides. This was it. She had to tell him. She had to confront the reality of what had been happening. "Michael," she started, her voice shaking, "there's something I need to tell you." Michael turned to look at her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and concern. "What is it, Elena?" Her heart pounded in her chest as the truth hung on the tip of her tongue. Could she say it? Could she face the consequences of her actions? Elena faltered. She couldn't do it. Not yet. She couldn't break him. Not like this. "I don't know how to fix this," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what's happening to us." The next few days felt like a slow-motion train wreck. Elena woke up every morning dreading the moment when the truth would finally come to light. She tried to hide the guilt behind a smile, tried to pretend that things were okay, but it was no use. The secret she'd been carrying was suffocating her, and every conversation with Michael felt like a lie. Every touch from him felt wrong. She had been avoiding Chris's messages, ignoring his calls, but it was clear that her connection with him was not something that could be ignored. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel his presence, the way he made her feel alive, seen, but at the same time, she couldn't escape the nagging guilt that constantly gnawed at her. That afternoon, when Michael came home early from work, Elena knew something had shifted. He walked into the house with a look on his face, a combination of exhaustion and frustration. His silence was loud, more intense than it had ever been. "Michael," Elena started, her voice trembling slightly. "What's going on? You've been quiet lately." He didn't immediately answer. He walked past her, his face tense, his shoulders stiff. Elena followed him into the living room, unsure of what to expect. "I need to ask you something," Michael said, his voice heavy. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers, as if he was trying to read her, to understand something that was hidden behind her facade. Elena felt her heart race, her breath shallow. She knew what was coming. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt like she was going to crumble. "What is it, Michael?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot," he said slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And I think I know what's been going on. I don't know how to say this, but I've seen the way you've been looking at me lately, the way you've been avoiding me, and I can feel that something's off. I'm not stupid, Elena." Her stomach dropped. He knew. She couldn't lie anymore. There was no point in pretending. "I've tried to push it away," Michael continued, his voice growing quieter. "But I can't ignore it anymore. And I need to know, is there someone else?" The words hit Elena like a tidal wave. Someone else. The truth, so simple and direct, was now hanging in the air between them. Her heart ached as she realized that she couldn't keep hiding from it, couldn't keep pretending. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words, but all she could do was look at Michael. How could she tell him? How could she possibly explain what she had done? Elena began, but the words felt stuck, lodged in her throat, as if they were too heavy to speak. The guilt overwhelmed her, and the tears she had been holding back for so long started to spill over. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I've made a mistake, Michael. A huge mistake. There's no excuse for what I've done." Michael's face fell, his expression one of disbelief, hurt, and sadness. "Who is it?" he asked softly, his voice shaking. "Is it Chris?" The question hung in the air, as if it were the final blow. Elena didn't know how to respond. The truth was right there, staring her in the face. And for the first time, she couldn't hide from it. The shame that had been gnawing at her for days, for weeks, came crashing over her in waves. I didn't mean for this to happen," Elena said, her voice trembling. "I never planned for it, but it just happened. I don't know how it happened, Michael, but it did. And I regret it. I regret everything." Michael took a step back, his face pale as if the air had been knocked out of him. His hands were shaking as he ran them through his hair. "How long has this been going on, Elena?" His voice cracked, the pain evident in every word. "I don't know," Elena admitted, her voice raw with emotion. "A few weeks. I don't even know what's real anymore, Michael. Everything's a mess. And I know I've hurt you. I've ruined everything. I can't take it back." Michael turned away, his back to her. Elena could hear the sharp intake of breath as he tried to hold back the tears. She wanted to reach out to him, to apologize, to make it right, but she knew it was too late for that. The damage had already been done. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Michael said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know if I can look at you the same way again." Elena felt a sharp pain in her chest. This was it. The truth had torn them apart. There was no going back from here. "I love you," Elena whispered, though it felt hollow, like the words were coming from someone else. "But I've destroyed everything." The days following Michael's confrontation were a blur. Elena tried to go through the motions of daily life, caring for the kids, making meals, cleaning the house, but everything felt like it was happening around her. She was numb. She couldn't process the weight of what she had done, the devastation she had caused. Michael didn't speak to her much in the days after their conversation. He avoided her gaze, kept his distance. Elena knew he was trying to process the betrayal, trying to understand how it had come to this. She had tried to apologize, tried to explain herself, but every time she opened her mouth, it felt like the words fell flat. The truth was, there was no way to fix this. There was no way to undo the hurt she had caused. One evening, Elena sat in the living room, staring at the walls, her mind racing. She had always believed that they would weather any storm together, that no matter what came their way, Michael and she would be able to face it. But now everything felt shattered. Michael had barely spoken to her since their conversation. She knew he was struggling, but so was she. She had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and the weight of that guilt was suffocating her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Chris. Elena hesitated for a moment before opening it. She hadn't heard from him since the confrontation. After that night, she hadn't wanted to face him. She knew she had to make a choice, but she wasn't sure she was ready. "Elena, I can't stop thinking about you. I know things are messed up, but I want you to know I'm here for you. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Elena read the message over and over. Her heart ached as she thought about Chris, about the way he made her feel, alive, wanted. But the reality of what she had done, the pain she had caused Michael, made everything else seem insignificant. What had she done? She didn't respond to Chris's message. The thought of seeing him again filled her with both longing and regret. How could she even look at him after what she had done? Later that evening, Michael finally spoke to her. He had come downstairs after putting the kids to bed. Elena looked at him as he stood in the doorway, his eyes filled with pain and exhaustion. He looked so different from the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had always been a rock. Now he was just a shell of himself, his once confident demeanor replaced by doubt and sadness. "Elena," Michael started, his voice low and measured. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what happened, and I need to ask you something." Elena felt her heart race, a lump forming in her throat. What now? She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the silence between them had been unbearable. The truth had to come out one way or another. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I've hurt you. I've betrayed you in ways I can never take back." Michael sighed, his hand running through his hair as he looked away. "I don't know how we got here, Alina. I don't know how everything changed so fast, but I need to know, do you still love me?" The question hit her like a tidal wave. Do you still love me? How could she answer that? How could she look at him and say the words she knew he needed to hear when everything inside her felt so broken? "I don't know," Alina admitted, her voice shaking. "I want to, but I've lost myself in all of this. I've lost everything." She could see the hurt in his eyes, and it broke her. Michael had always been the one to hold things together, to make her feel safe. But now she had broken him, and she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know if she could. The next few days were filled with tense silences and awkward conversations. Alina avoided Michael as much as possible, not because she wanted to, but because the weight of the truth was too much to bear. Every time she looked at him, she saw the pain in his eyes. She saw the trust he had placed in her and the way she had shattered it. One evening, Michael sat down next to her on the couch. It had been days since they had talked seriously, and the silence between them felt like a chasm that was growing wider with each passing moment. "I need you to tell me the truth," Michael said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to know where your heart is, Alina, because right now I don't think I know you anymore." Alina closed her eyes, feeling the tears welling up. The truth was right there, on the tip of her tongue. She had to tell him. But how could she? How could she say the words that would shatter everything, knowing that there was no way to put the pieces back together? I don't know what I want anymore, Michael," Alina said, the words coming out in a broken whisper. "I love you, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if we can fix this." Michael didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his face a mixture of hurt and resignation. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Alina. I don't know if I can look at you the same way again." The house felt empty now. The once warm, familiar space was now a suffocating reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Alina moved through the rooms mechanically, her hands numb as she tidied up, trying to distract herself from the gnawing emptiness inside her. But nothing could fill the space that had been left behind. Michael hadn't spoken to her in days. He came home, ate his meals in silence, and retreated to the guest room at night. Alina knew he was processing, but the silence between them felt deafening. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was the emotional gap that had opened between them. A gap so wide that no apology, no promise could bridge it. She tried to reach out to him, tried to apologize in ways that felt hollow, desperate. But Michael wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't respond to her words. He had told her over and over that he didn't know if he could forgive her. And in the end, Alina wasn't sure if she could forgive herself. One evening, after another long day of silence, Alina found herself sitting in the living room, her hands clenched in her lap. The guilt, the shame, had become her constant companions. She stared at the empty spot on the couch where Michael used to sit beside her, where they used to talk, laugh, dream together. Now it felt like a ghost of what it once was. She could hear the distant sound of Michael moving around upstairs, but she didn't call out to him. She didn't know what to say anymore. The truth was she had destroyed everything, and there was no going back. Later that night, when Michael came downstairs, Alina was still sitting on the couch, staring at the floor. She could feel him standing in the doorway, watching her, but neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of everything they had both lost. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice low and quiet. "I don't know where we go from here, Alina. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I also don't know if I can live without you." Alina's heart shattered at his words. The pain in his voice was unbearable, and yet she couldn't deny the truth of it. They had both been living in a lie for so long, pretending everything was fine when it was falling apart in pieces. The damage had been done. "Michael," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion, "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen, but I've broken us. I don't know if I can fix it." I don't know if we can fix this. Michael stepped closer, his eyes filled with tears, but he didn't reach for her. The distance between them was now palpable, impossible to bridge. He stood there searching her face for some sign that things could go back to what they once were, but the truth was staring them both in the face. "Alina," he said softly, his voice trembling, "I want to believe that we can work through this. I want to believe that we can rebuild what we had. But the truth is, I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." The words hit Alina like a physical blow. She wanted to cry, to beg him to forgive her, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. There was no undoing the pain, no taking back the betrayal. She stood up, her legs shaking, her heart aching. "I've lost everything, Michael, and I don't even know who I am anymore." There was a long pause. Michael didn't speak, but his eyes were filled with something Alina couldn't quite name. Hurt, disappointment, but also a lingering sadness that had consumed them both. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's time for us to part ways. I can't keep living in this limbo. I can't keep pretending everything's fine." Alina felt her chest tighten as the weight of his words crashed down on her. This was it, the end of everything, the end of the life they had built together, the end of the love they had once shared. She had destroyed it all. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words slipping out as tears welled in her eyes. "I never wanted this." Michael nodded slowly, his face a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I know, but sometimes love isn't enough to fix the broken pieces. Maybe it's time we both face the truth." That night, Alina lay in bed alone, staring up at the ceiling. The weight of what had happened, of the life she had lost, pressed down on her. She could feel the emptiness in the room, the silence where there had once been laughter, comfort, and warmth. The tears fell silently, but they didn't bring relief. They didn't take away the pain or the shame. She had lost everything.